Your brain on climate.
In the summer of 2016, the Mayor of London was spending a lot of time on a big red bus. Not so unusual, you might think. London is, after all, full of big red buses, but this was a different bus. This bus was a luxury coach. The 13-metre-long, 50-seat Neoplan Starliner. Not the kind of bus you get in to pop to the shops. A hospitality suite on wheels. DVD players, big fridges, reclining leather seats. Yeah, the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, was on this bus.
I'm full of energy.
The bus travelled around the country in that spring of 2016. It would stop in places that would later vote heavily to leave the EU, places like Sunderland, Stoke-on-Trent and Grimsby. When it stopped, out would pop the politicians and the apparatchiks to be greeted by an army of journalists and photographers, as well as crowds of the public. The politicians would talk about the upcoming referendum on whether Britain should leave the EU. Their opinion, very strongly, was that Britain should.
Wheels on the bus go round and round, all through the town. The people on the bus go
Boris Johnson became one of the poster boys for the Brexit campaign. Think back to that turbulent time, and it might be his bleach blonde hair you see bobbing along on top of his head, saying things like this.
Will continue to be like passengers locked in the back of a minicab with a wonky sat-nav, driven by a driver who doesn't have perfect command of English and going in a direction we frankly don't want to go.
But there's another iconic image might be burned into your minds, and that's of the bus itself, because the bus they were on wasn't just a means of transport. It was a 13-metre long, great big moving billboard. Emblazoned on the side of it was a number, and if you're from the UK, I bet you remember what that number was.
Suggestion, as you can see, is that we send £350 million a week to the EU, which could be spent on the NHS.
The NHS bus, with 350 million weekly that goes to the EU, it could fund the NHS.
We send the European Union £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. Vote leave. This number, £350 million a week, was the very centrepiece of the argument being made by the Leave campaign for why Britain should tear up its 40-plus year membership of the EU and go it alone. It was a clear, simple message, and it invited people to make a clear choice, to decide to do what was right and not what was wrong. And at the heart of it was a number. That number, that very large number, £350 million, which invited people to think that the size of the injustice was very large indeed. The problem was that the number, or at least what was being done with it, was by any reasonable standard, bollocks.
Do you mind me asking why? I'll tell you why, because it's balls, that's why.
It's kind of very vaguely sort of true, but as its proponents knew full well, basically not true. There were extensive squabbles then, I'm sure there still are, about the provenance of that number and its accuracy. The number was slapped down by the UK's official statisticians and by just about every economist who bothered to look at it. The NHS even complained to Vote Leave about the illegal use of its logo on the side of that bus. None of that mattered. In fact, it helped. Every rebuttal that repeated the figure, every correction, it just amplified it. And Boris Johnson happily kept on using it.
As a country, to take back control. Take back control of huge sums of money, of £350 million a week, and spend it on our priorities.
It was a brilliant political weapon, deployed brutally in Leave voting hotspots across Britain, splashed across the front page of newspapers for weeks. That it was bollocks was not the point. On this episode, we're going to be looking at numbers. Arithmetic and maths can tell us an extraordinary amount about the universe. Without numbers, we'd understand far less about the climate crisis, the ecosystem crisis, all of it. Never mind what the future under those things might plausibly look like. Numbers are useful, but around 21% of adults in the UK, that's just over 1 in 5, struggle beyond very basic numeracy. Many people, maybe even you, say they've got a kind of numerophobia, a fear of numbers. The good news is this isn't fixed, it's something we can do something about, as we'll find out. And that's good because, as we've already seen, the numbers we encounter in politics, in advertising, in business, and in daily life are rarely neutral or objective. Simple figures that claim to have objectively settled complex questions are usually built on very human value judgments, assumptions, shortcuts, and biases. Unpicking those can be fun and hugely revealing, and it tells you a lot about what someone wants you to believe about the world and what they want your brain to pay attention to. But without some basic number sense in our toolkit, we're left exposed. Numbers have power. And given that the history of humans trying to deal with climate change is, in large part, a history of people throwing numbers at each other, I thought it was worth an episode to ask why big numbers have got such a hold over us, and how we can take some of that power back. All that and more on this episode of Your Brain on Climate.
Your brain on climate.
Welcome to Your Brain on Climate, the show about human brains versus the climate crisis. I'm Dave, and in this episode we're making sense of how our brain makes sense of numbers and how to fight back against numbers that beguile, confuse or bewitch us. Before we get going, the usual reminder, this podcast is all made by me. I'm a humble indie podcaster. That actually means something. It means I wax the floorboards, I fix the roof of this thing with only the income that you generously give me. And I pay my guests because I value their time. And I hope you do too. So if you like what I do, if you want me to keep on doing it, please do consider chipping in just a couple of quid a month over at patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. And if you can't do that or you won't do that, a 5-star review and a written endorsement at your podcast medium of choice really does go a long way. Remember, if you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom. It means someone, usually my guest, has said something you would want to read more about. And if you check the show notes, there'll be a link to more information. Right, on with it. Joining me on this episode of Your Brain on Climate about numbers is the maths author and broadcaster, Rob Eastaway.
I mean, put in your own words, but written numerous books aimed at the general public about maths of everyday life, and often appears on radio and that sort of angle. But you know, I do tons of stuff with schools, of course, and other people as well.
Now, if you listen to any show about numbers or the news, like, for example, Radio 4's More or Less, then you've probably come across Rob. He's one of them brilliant maths communicator guys, you know, on a mission to give everyone, young and old, more confidence in using numbers, even making maths feel like fun. And if you're sitting there right now thinking, Dave, maths ain't fun, and it's never gonna be fun, well, you haven't spent enough time with Rob. His most recent book, Much Ado About Numbers, for example, is all about the maths that crops up all the way through Shakespeare plays. And one of his earlier books, Maths on the Back of an Envelope, is just a really great way to learn some tricks to get better at numbers quick. I first came across Rob on the aforementioned More or Less podcast, where he became immediately famous to me and will be always known as the Zequels guy. Puzzles. And when I first had the privilege of having a coffee with you, I knew you already as the Zequels guy. I knew you off of radio. You've been on More or Less as Zequels. I wonder if there's a few sort of little tips and tricks or puzzles or something you can give just to start this episode off by kind of inspiring people about how fun maths can be.
Yeah. Well, first of all, since you've mentioned Zequels, let's get that out of the way, because it's not really a puzzle, but it is fun. And it's how to make doing arithmetic much easier. And the answer to making difficult sums easier is to make the numbers easier. And Zequels is just a name I gave to something that people kind of instinctively do anyway, which is if you hear a number like 89.73, which is, that's a complex number, but it's very close to 90. So the idea is, if you want to do anything with that number, let's turn it into 90, because then the sums are easier. So I gave a name to this technique of rounding all numbers to one significant figure. So 89.73 is equals 90. 850,000 is equals 900,000. So, but like 7 is equals 7 because it's already one significant figure. So it's always, every number is reduced to being one digit followed by zeros if necessary. And that way you can suddenly add two numbers that are big, or multiply them or divide them. Like, what is 78.3 divided by 19.6? Calculate. Well, that equals 80 divided by 20. And I'd say that's a good, which is 8 divided by 2, which is 4. So I'm all for being able to do simple arithmetic in your head. And the way to do that is by equals, turning everything into simple arithmetic. So that's
yeah, okay. So that technique isn't going to get you a Nobel Prize for accurate mathematics, but it is going to it's going to make you quicker at the supermarket.
It certainly is. And it's going to make you quicker in a more serious context. If you're listening to politicians throw numbers at you, or in a business deal, you're going to say, well, look, we're talking 1 million. That's nothing compared with 1 billion or whatever. So it's going to cut through the minutiae to get to see the bigger picture. And a lot of what we're going to talk about, I think, is talking about seeing the bigger picture. And a lot of what gets in the way is people going down blind arrows or getting obsessed with detail. In the case of maths, a lot of people think of maths as being getting exactly the right answer. Well, actually, there's a different approach to maths, which is to say ballpark, and getting a feel and a sense of number, which is very much not about exactly the right answer, but it's close enough. So that's where that skill comes in. So that's one of the sort of, it's being playful, but I wouldn't say that's a puzzly example. But okay, I'll give you a thing that people have found amazingly playful, fun, wowsy, that's sort of not a puzzle, but it's I never knew that. This was when I went viral. I might have discussed it with you before, but anyway, I've never been viral in my life till 2024 when BBC recorded me doing an interview with Tim Harford, the broadcaster, and Chris Mason, the BBC political correspondent. And we were talking about how to do numbers quickly in your head if you're on radio or whatever. And I brought up, what is an Oldchester? I did not invent this. It comes up on social media every 2 years, but it was, what is 16% of 25? Which is a difficult one. And you think, I'm going to have 10% and 6%. But it turns out 16% of 25 is the same as 25% of 16. And we all know 25% is a quarter. A quarter of 16 is 4. So there we are. How cool is that? So, yeah.
So find the easier of the two sums of inverting those things and do that
exactly.
one. Yeah.
The reason it works is something we've all known since childhood, or I'll remind people if they've forgotten, which is that 4 times 7 is the same as 7 times 4. If you think about all multiplications as being a big bar of chocolate, then the number of chunks.
I'm literally writing down everything you say. This is good.
So yeah, if a bar of chocolate that's 4 by 7 and 7 by 4, it's still got 28 chunks in it, and taking a percentage of, 73% of 20. Is just multiplying 73 times 20, and then it's divided by 100. But the order in which you do multiplication doesn't matter for the chocolate bar rule. And so there we go. It's rather cool that a difficult sounding calculation becomes easy. And a lot of being good at arithmetic is knowing the tricks, in quotes. It's when you multiply by 9, multiply by 10 instead, and 10 take one of the thing off. So 9 times 83 is 10 times 83. Take away 83, which you might find easier. If you find it easier and quicker, then so much. And when you see occasionally, you don't see them very often these days, performing arithmeticians who can do amazing calculations, it's partly because they've just learned fantastic shortcuts for doing all these things and wowing their friends. And it is a cool skill to have, a much undervalued skill to be able to do arithmetic. But often it is sort of, it's like tricks.
You like this. Not a lot, but you like it.
And then something else, which is another thing that's a sort of, it's a people always talk about it and always wowed by it. And I did it actually with a bunch of doctors in a little workshop not long ago, talking about probability, which people struggle with probability and how counterintuitive it is. And it's very important part of the way the world operates, decisions are made and everything else. So it's an important but mind-blowing topic, which I always happen to have been quite good at, possibly because I'm a game player. Or maybe I'm a good game player because I like probability. One way around, I like poker and everything else, which is all about probability. One is my favorite party trick, which again, some listeners will be familiar with, but they're not. It's a wowie, which is how many people do you need to have in a room for there to be a 50-50 chance that two people have the same birthday? Now, do you know this one, Dave? Is this one you're familiar?
How many people do you have to have in the same room that there's a 50-50 chance
that there's two people there with the same birthday? It's 365 days in a year, so
the gut instinct you would reach for would be half of 365.
Like 180 people. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
And the amazing fact is that it's only 23. 23 people in a room. There is a 50-50 chance. Like half the time you do this experiment, you're going to find two people with the same birthday. And 98% of the time or whatever, two people are going to be within a day of each other, which is really surprising. And the way you check it is football was clearly invented for doing the birthday check, because you count all the players plus the ref, check their birthdays for the next weekend of football matches. You'll find in half of the matches, you got two people with the same birthday. It's a sort of, how can this possibly be true? This feels like magic. But it's because we're conflating two different ideas, which is kind of what's the chance of two individuals having the same birthday as each other, two chosen people, which is as compared with, think of all the possible pairs you can get out of 23 people. There's one guy with 22 others, and then the second guy with 21 others. By the time you add all of that, there's actually lots of combinations there. It gets harder and harder to avoid two of them having the same birthday. So that's a lovely one that people can test out.
Yes. You can do that in your workplace or your classroom or wherever, can't you?
Yeah, exactly. And to make it, to be confident of working, just make the number 40 or 50, and then it becomes in the high 90s. It's and so there we are. That's the thing to do when you're in a large cluster party. Say, stop everyone, I'm going to do an amazing thing. And who knows, you may make or lose friends as a result. It's a good bet. It's a good bet to win. A friend of mine was on a flight where there were about 30 people on the flight, and he bet one of his colleagues that there were two people on that flight had the same birthday, and he won that bet because the odds were in his favour with 30 people. So there we go.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It's a very good way to start.
So Rob gave me some other examples in there. One of them was about the famous Monty Hall problem. I cut that out because I covered that quite a bit on a recent episode from just over a year ago called Common Sense. If you want to learn more about a real-life example of counterintuitive probability, go back and listen to that. But you get the idea. Rob knows his numbers. You get the idea. You've got a sense that Rob has thought about human weaknesses and blind spots when it comes to numbers, and why being good at arithmetic is often, as he says, about knowing the tricks that other people don't. Now, I'm into that stuff too, for slightly different reasons that we'll come to. But listen, Your Brain on Climate is not a maths podcast. We are here to think about human brains and how they work. So later on, Rob and I will talk about how numbers can be used to psychologically trick you, and how you better wise up and see that kind of bullshit coming. But before that, I couldn't help but ask Rob a question of quite ridiculous scale.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a very good place to start.
What is maths? Like, what is it? Well, because it's sort of about doing sums in our head to represent the universe, but does maths kind of exist? Is it an objective thing, or is it a thing that only exists in our head, or what?
Yeah, I always duck this question because I'm
not allowed to. I don't want it ducked.
So I'm not ducking. Drat, you got me in square in your eyes. I can't get out. I mean, I like people who sort of say basically maths is about finding patterns and finding connections between patterns and seeing that this pattern arises here and that pattern arises there, but they're sort of they're connected in some way. There's some relationship between those patterns, and it's quantifying those patterns as well. So that's a sort of the deeper thing, and those patterns exist whether we spot them or not. So arguably maths is there, and then we're finding it, because it was still true that circles ratio of circumference to the diameter was pi before we first measured this, and so, but then by spotting it, and then by spotting that pi crops up in other seemingly nothing to do with circle situations is really interesting. Why would the adding up this series of fractions end up at pi when there's nothing to do with a circle? If you go deeper enough, you suddenly begin to see why actually it is connected to a circle, but in a very profound way that it's taken a lot of research and discovery to find out. So that's what it is, and of course that is very different from the way maths is used in everyday life, which is working out what your bill should be divided into when there's 5 of you having pizza. But the reason why dividing by 5 works, and why those methods work, and so on, that in the end that all relates to how number works, and it fits into the broader series of patterns. But arithmetic is at one end of the functional, practical end, and calculation is one end, and that's what people tend to think of as maths. But of course, much deeper, and many mathematicians would say, I don't do calculation. I'm hopeless at sums, but I'm a mathematician, because they're about thinking about pattern and connections, and the notion of proof, and saying, I can show you that this situation doesn't just apply here, but will apply to every other situation, and it will do so forever. And I'm the first person to identify this, so my name is on it. And it's not going to get fiddled around with. It's not going to be Isaac Newton getting fiddled around with by Einstein, who finds a little nuance that changes it, whatever. Once you've found it and proved it, you're done, which is quite different from pretty much anything else in the universe, I think.
Morelli, I'm a tough guy. Tough guys don't do math. Tough guys deep fried chicken for a living. So, Orale, you want a wing or a leg, man?
My guest on this episode of Your Brain on Climate is Rob Eastaway. He's a maths communicator and he loves numbers. He thinks we can all demystify maths and arithmetic a bit and just get a bit more confident in basic number common sense. Now, partially, I think this is Rob is one of them geezers who just loves maths and he wants you to love it a bit more too. But there's a bit more to it than that. Rob sees losing our numerophobia, our fear of numbers, as a critical defence strategy against the world's bullshit and manipulation. It's a kind of democracy thing, and I am all for it. I agree with Rob 110%, if that's not too strange a number, that strange numbers can be used to make things sound difficult and complicated, and to make people sound authoritative and clever, when in fact the number is strange and it's all much simpler than that, and they are probably just talking rubbish. Now, we started this episode with perhaps the best example of recent times of how made-up numbers can be used to hammer home a wider political campaign. Whether they're right or wrong, indisputably, numbers carry a particular heft and weight and influence on us. And we, says Rob, need to get smart about it. I was really interested in what you said about proof, because one of the things in our society that it seems to me maths is used for is closing down an argument. So you will see politicians do this all the time. They will go, well, we would love to open loads of hospitals, but we've only got £69.5 million to spend, and it will cost, and so therefore the maths say we can't do it. Do you recognise that, and where do you think that comes from?
Well, it sort of links back to what I was saying about using big numbers to intimidate, or, using precise numbers to intimidate as well. I sometimes say never trust anyone who, especially when talking about the future, uses any more than 2 significant figures. So, next year, the number of doctors we're going to need is 8,422 more than this year, when you think, well, how do you know? It's so plus or minus, you can't possibly know. So people turn vague numbers into or numbers with uncertainty into a specific number with this sort of underlying message of, and this shows I know what I'm talking about because I have researched it. I've worked it out. So it's like it's used as a weapon in that respect. And everyone does that. In business, it's used. Someone sounds like they're very confident when they use these numbers, whereas someone else who says, "Oh, it's going to be about 10,000," they're being very reasonable when they say that, but you think, "Oh, they're a bit weak, though, aren't they? Because they clearly don't know, and they're trying to be kind here." So, it's the same way as people use long words instead of using a short word to intimidate, but they sound cleverer. It's annoying, but they do. So you tend to pay consultants more when they use big words than the ones who tell you what in words that a 10-year-old would use, because you think, oh, if it's that simple, maybe you're not worth $1,000 a day or whatever people pay consultants. So that was interesting. I mentioned that was, I did spend a bit of my early career working for a management consultancy, and it was a funny world to be in, where you sort of felt this pressure to make things sound complicated because you get more money that way. Why do this job in a day if you can do it in 10 days? Because the fees are proportionate to the number of days, not the quality of the output. So all of that is wrapped in the way people are using numbers, as a tool as well as to communicate. So
yeah, and it's kind of having access to some sort of higher power, isn't it? It's almost like there's, particularly in the way that our, very kind of number-based society works, where by referring to a number, it's like a high priesthood. You're kind of summoning this kind of higher power. You're like, look, it's not me, it's the numbers, and you're not only are you showing that you're clever and you've worked it out, but you're almost deferring a kind of moral job to the numbers of the universe.
Which is why, having some numbers in your own armory to fight back is very important, or the ability to challenge the number by saying, where did that come from? What if you change this assumption? What does that do to the figures? Or when they say, politician says, but look, we're spending, a million on houses, whatever. You say, yeah, but you need 10 billion to do it. It's 0.1%. Just because you've got an example or something's being done doesn't mean that equates to the scale of what needs to be done. And of course, as a political tool, that's used all the time, as a general principle, A, but I've got a counterexample, B, and therefore that negates the whole thing, which of course is ridiculous because they're on totally different scales. But our brains are not very good at saying, these two things are not equal. One counterexample is often enough to win an argument, which is sad, but a fact of life.
Yeah, I've definitely been. So I worked as a economist, sort of, kind of, for a few years. I retrained as one in my late 20s, and it was great in lots of ways to sort of a bit later in life do some crunchy maths and actually realise, well, firstly, what I couldn't do, so my brain's not really cut out for it, but realise that a lot of it is just a basic confidence in being able to move numbers around, and that's quite useful. And also to realise how much of the numbers that are thrown around are basically just based on either assumptions or based on guesswork, or both, right? But turned into a number in order, often in political scenarios, often that number is used to defend a thing that someone wanted to do anyway. And the reason they've come up with that number is because their assumptions happen to back their worldview. An example of that is stuff around like how much it costs to decarbonise the economy by the year 2050, where somebody will come up with a number going, oh, it's going to cost 2% of GDP. And then you dig into it and you look into it and you work out that's because it assumes lots of bad things will happen. Yes. Because it assumes, people will spend more money on driving their cars. Doesn't have to be like that. There's another set of assumptions you could do, which would change those numbers. So I'm very much aware of the way that certainly in politics and in policy making and management consultancy and all the rest of it, that actually the numbers that are used are sort of proxies for a set of moral judgments almost, or guesses about the future that people use.
And you reminded me of the thing, where there can be a tendency of there's various factors, and we know this one's going to be about 100, this one's going to be about 1,000, and we can work those out. But this other one's going to be about 10 million. And we, And that's the biggest factor involved. But often people will conflate all of these things together, and they'll throw in the one that they can work out exactly. But in the end, all of that's irrelevant because there's one big thing that blows everything out of the water. And the sort of jokey story I always tell is like this with the guy who goes to a natural history museum, and there's a T-Rex on display, a skeleton. And he says, "Oh, that's amazing. How old is that?" And the guide says, it's 64 million years and 23 days. He says, "That's amazing. How do you know it to such incredible precision?" And the guy said, "Well, when I started working here, it was 64 million years old. And that was 23 days ago." And you sort of get some spurious precision, and we all kind of laugh at that, but that's kind of what's going on. It's, the elephant in the room, the dinosaur in the room is this massive number, which makes everything else you're doing. And I suppose on an environmental scale, we all do it. I sort of think, I'm going to keep this water bottle rather than keep it and just refill it with water rather than always buying a water bottle. And I'm doing my bit for the planet. And you cannot argue, I am doing my bit for the planet. But as soon as I drive to the supermarket or wherever else, anything I've done with that bottle is numerically irrelevant. Of course, I don't want to tell people not to do that, and I don't want to not do it myself. I like the virtue of it. I like the principle. But if you're being hard-nosed about it, it's the driving to super, or classically, it's the flying to somewhere that sort of, and people say, I do everything for the environment, this, that, and the other. Oh, but I do every year like to just have my trip to Africa because I want to save the planet by looking at animals. And you think, well,
Your brain on climate.
Welcome back to Your Brain on Climate. I'm Dave, and on this episode I'm talking all about numbers with the maths author, commentator, cricket nerd and all-round interesting bloke, Rob Eastaway. What have we covered so far? We've done fun puzzles, we've done gentle musing about the metaphysics of maths, and we've started to lift up the flaps on the power that number has in our political discourse and in our wider life. Now, before we go any further, a tangent. This is about badger economics. That's right, the economics of badgers. Skip ahead a couple of minutes if you don't like the idea of the economics of badgers. Now, as I mentioned back a little bit there, I used to work, kind of, as an economist. Strange though a lot of people who know me now would think. I called myself a political economist, really, though, and that was for three reasons. Firstly, because it sounds cool. Secondly, because even though studying economics in my early 30s did indeed give me a lot of confidence with maths, equations and stuff like that, if I'm honest, I found some of the harder stuff just remained a bit too hard. There are real economists who eat numbers for breakfast in a way I never quite could, and I never went to the fierce places. But thirdly, I called myself a political economist, and this is the important bit, because what interested me most weren't Excel spreadsheets or price demand curves or any of that. It was how numbers get used in politics, how those numbers get made, and how you might undermine them and get better ones if you want to make a different point. Because it is a pretty iron rule of political economics that just about any number you hear used by anyone is reliant on assumptions about the world that someone else could, if they wanted, challenge and thus change the number. I'm afraid to say that goes for whoever you think the good guys are as much as the bad guys. I'm not talking about like climate science here. I'm talking about numbers used in politics. You know the kind of thing. Now, a good example of that is the government policy in the mid-2010s to cull large numbers of badgers. Now, ostensibly, this was to reduce bovine TB, which, it was said, badgers, who live in the countryside, were giving to cows who live in farms. The government argued that killing badgers would save money overall. You'd have to spend a lot of money shooting badgers, but you'd more than make that back by reducing TB transmission and not having to compensate farmers so much for fewer lost cows. Now, even at the time, if you dug into it, as I did, that calculation was flimsy. It relied on a few key assumptions. One of these was that policing costs, like dealing with protests because people don't like badgers being killed, would be on the low side. That was the assumption the government used. If you assumed anything else, like that actually policing costs would be higher because protests would be higher, then the policy stopped making economic sense on its own terms. It no longer saved more money than it cost. And that's, of course, exactly what happened, as anyone who had an eye on the public backlash could and indeed did predict. Policing costs turn out to be very high, £3 million a year at least. And that's before you even get to the awkward question of whether shooting badgers in the face was actually an effective way of reducing TB in cattle. Because more than a decade on, the evidence remains decidedly mixed. So badger diversion over. The point is, you always need to look into the numbers, particularly when someone is trying to say a thing makes sense because of a number. They're trying to use that number to describe why we should or shouldn't do something, which you might disagree with. And in recent years, there's been one area of environmental economics above all where numbers have increasingly strayed, and I've never quite been sure they belong there at all. And that's putting a price in pounds and pence on nature.
Giving it a price tag would make farming just $300 million trees very expensive. And chopping down an old tree to plant a new one would be bad business.
It's making me think a bit about the whole, I don't know how much you know about this, Rob, but the whole sort of putting a price on the value of nature stuff, which is very possibly slightly less in vogue than it was about sort of 10, 15 years ago. I've had a couple of conversations with people recently who once thought that was, putting numbers on things was the way to kind of save the planet. I've got a bit jaded about it. But the basic idea that, like, creating an economic argument that says if we save the whales, that will be worth £29.6 trillion, often £29.623 trillion
yes.
to the economy. Yeah. And I have always found it kind of morally repugnant, but whilst also unfortunately accepting that, if someone in power listens to that, that might be worth doing.
Yes.
I'm not asking you necessarily to sort of come down on the moral side, but what do you think about doing that?
There's a part of me that says, numbers, if you're saying this is important, this is less important, numbers is one objective clinical way of doing it. Is how much you read into it once you've done it, accepting just how arbitrary this is and how many assumptions this has got, and someone else equally thoughtful, you come up with it saves 29 billion and someone else comes up with, 1 million, or it actually costs the planet for X, but at least it puts a number on an argument. And so in that respect, it might carry things forward and it might focus people's minds. It gives them something, a target to aim at and to argue around, rather than this is very important. Well, this is very important. Well, this is very, very important. How do those relate to each other? It certainly made me think, actually, slightly off at a tangent, but a friend of mine, Matt Parker, who does a very popular YouTube channel, did a thing about pain of stings. It's a really good video out in the Amazon rainforest, I think, getting he and colleagues getting themselves bitten by ants and bugs and spiders or whatever, and just saying how much on a scale of ouch, if the first little nick was worth 1 unit, how much was this ant and how much was this termite or whatever, and putting numbers to it. And it was actually remarkable. One of them sort of gave the most painful like a 300. One of them gave it a 5,000.
We need to put some numbers on the pain to test the other hypothesis. So there are legitimate reasons why you want to be able to do this, which is very little comfort, because the next one is a big angry wasp.
For this next sort of gave the most painful like a 300. One of them gave it a 5,000. But there was a sort of ballpark. They were putting numbers to a thing that doesn't have a number. It's just a feeling. And yet, out of it came a sense of something meaningful that you could quantify and argue about. So, there is something. But of course, that's a slightly less emotive thing than, sense of planet and all those other areas. So it's just it's always a danger of taking... If you take all the emotion out of it and the feeling and the caring or whatever, you lose half the important argument with something like climate, for example.
I suppose we wouldn't be... You were talking about probability earlier, and I suppose we wouldn't be able even to understand that there was a climate crisis going on without numbers, really, and without probability, which is largely, I did an episode recently about forecasting the weather and forecasting climate, and largely, this is very, very large supercomputers talking to other very large supercomputers, modeling the mathematical odds of, things happening. And it's pretty extraordinary that we can kind of do that, I think.
It is. And actually, it's interesting, those people who want to challenge and argue about climate, I mean, it's fair enough to have an opinion, to challenge, but they will often dodge the rational, the rational numerical or other argument in it and say, well, so you're against climate change. Which bit of it? Because there's a whole thing. First of all, do you or do you not accept there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Here is a graph. And if you don't accept this graph, where's your graph coming? I mean, there will almost be an element sometimes that, stats, those, I don't even want to believe the stats that you've produced for me, and I'm not sure where you go from that. If someone's collated into impartially some stats about number of carbon dioxide, the proportion of it in the atmosphere, and you don't believe that, then I'm not sure where you go from that. But often they say, oh, no, I accept that. And then you say, well, the next thing is, does that affect global warming? And then, here a model. And again, do you challenge that? And then you say, if it does affect global warming, what's the impact that has on the climate? So there's all these, there's lots of stages of mathematical modeling right to the end one, which is it better to live with the consequences or do something about it? Which again, and what's the impact going to be on the economy? What's the practicalities of it? But it's like people just want to dismiss the whole thing. It'd be interesting to take one of the extreme, in American, this is the mainstream politics now, but to sit them down and say, look, I'm happy to have the argument, but I want to have it at the same place. So at what point do you disagree with the stats? Because they don't seem to do that. They just seem to say, this is a terrible thing. It's a woke thing or whatever. And I think that's a very, they're scared of getting into the argument, or they're ignorant. They just don't understand it. They are mathematically not capable of getting, if A then B and therefore C, and they say, oh yeah, but I feel like it shouldn't be C. And well, you can feel what you like.
Don't care what you think, mate. Here's a calculator.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It's a very good way to very good way.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts.
So we talked about, the prevalence of numbers being used in our society, if not to con us exactly, to kind of make, to get people to do stuff they might not otherwise do. Here's you go and buy a car and there's an interest rate on that car, and then you realise it's all traps. It's part of, I think, a bit of a weariness that we're seeing in our society at the moment with what we're being told. Do you know what I mean? Where I think the use
we've had enough of experts is the sort of
right. And Michael Gove said that and got pilloried for it. And what I think he was trying to say is, there is a reflex going on in the country of people going, you can prove anything with stats, and I've been told a load of stuff with numbers that hasn't worked out to be well for me. So how about you do something else? So I wonder if there is something about, like, because maths and numbers, I know these things are different, but because numbers are often used to bewitch and befuddle as much as they're used to illuminate, that maybe there's an element of me goes, well, it's probably reasonable to kind of go, well, where'd you get them numbers from, mate? Because they're not the numbers I've got.
No, I absolutely. And, there's this BBC podcast, More or Less, which is the best example of taking all numbers and challenge it. The best thing you can do is to have reasonable debate around those numbers and to ask questions and say, where did this number come from? And, that's what that entire thing is dedicated to. And we should all be, and anyone who puts out a number, it should be part of the package. Part of the deal is, and now you can challenge me on that, including, the number one thing, not only where did that number come from and so on, but what's the uncertainty on that? When I say it's 100, do I mean 100 or do I mean 100 plus or minus 50? And that's often lacking in the statement in the first place, that whole uncertainty thing, because it's a messy thing, and people people like to have a simple answer rather than a vague, it's somewhere in this range. So, but that's where the healthy discussion number comes from when you talk about the uncertainties in it.
Which is where I think a lot of the climate science stuff can get in communications terms, a bit fiddly, because for the listeners, for the avoidance of doubts, climate change is real. It is happening. We're causing it. It's going to be bad. But what we can't say for sure is exactly what that looks like in practice. What we can do, I understand, through very clever supercomputers and maths, is there is a high probability, there's a medium probability, it's a 75% probability that we're all going to die or whatever. That's a really hard thing to communicate to people who hear medium probability and think, that's all right then, that's fine. I'll take my odds on that. Are we sort of biased, do you think, towards not really understanding that a medium probability of the death of all life on Earth is a bad thing?
Yeah, I think we probably are, because then you look out the window and say, but actually, it's a nice day today, and I can still go out and buy my coffee and stuff. So it's not happening now. And I think there's a bias to, if you can't see it now, then whatever you're told about what might happen, you're not feeling it now. So I think that might be wired into our brains to an extent. And also the way your whole thing, of course, we don't know what the consequences are, and that's an out for people as well. So you don't even know what the future will be. Well, exactly, we don't. All we can say is it's a range, but people like to know this is the consequence, and they like to reflect on things after the event. So it's a classic thing about decision making. You decide to, in football match, to pick a certain player, or a penalty taker decides to aim right. Well, that might be a good decision. Goalkeeper then saves it, but after the event, people say, "What a terrible decision," because it went wrong. Not because it wasn't a bad decision, but because it went wrong, which is not the way to evaluate decisions. So we're just not good at being wise and understanding of, we don't know exactly what the right thing to do is, but we know that this, on balance, is better than this. So there's an element of that, but there's also selfishness that if achieving this goal means me losing out, it basically means me losing out more than my neighbor, then I really don't want that to happen. That counts more for me in my own mental model than being good for everyone. I think we're all a bit guilty of that in lots of different ways. So, I suppose the human brain geared to be selfish and to be personal and to be all about individual experience, not about whole experience, because it's about saving you, not saving other people. The selfish gene, is that the same model? I don't know, but yeah,
selfish bastard. That's a model.
Yeah, but certainly, you see this sort of irrationality all the time, because it's kind of the way we're often having to fight against. And that's why counterintuitive probability things work so well, because people are only surprised because their brain is expecting other patterns.
We're nearly at the end of my chat with Rob Eastaway, and I do hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a chat all about how to conquer our numerophobia and why we need to maths up a bit. Rob's a crusader for getting more people to be roughly right in their day-to-day arithmetic, so that they can fight back against people who try to trick you with gammy numbers. Now, one of the things I love about this podcast is getting to meet smart, generous people like Rob. You probably have picked up that while we agree on a lot, we're kind of different people. We come at this from slightly different places. Rob is one of them numbers and rationality guys who I'm kind of quietly envious of. I'm more drawn to the squishiness and irrationality of humans because I'm kind of squishy and irrational by nature. But look, we need both, right? As we've talked about throughout this episode, the foundations of climate science are numbers. Building solar panels needs someone to marshal some numbers. Making the case inside a business for a better way of doing business, that needs numbers too. We ain't going to deal with climate change without using numbers. Let's not be all Johnny no numbers about things. But at the same time, we've got to understand the weirdness of human brains. We are organic beings. We run on evolved gloopy hardware wired first and foremost to stay alive long enough to reproduce, not to think about numbers. For all the impressive rationality we can muster when we concentrate hard enough, our brains are still biased, they're still emotional, and they're still easily led. And onto that squishy hardware, come numbers. They arrive often with a kind of godlike authority, or certainly that's how they're marshalled. Look at my number, we are told. You are messy and squishy. That is real and objective. It has a status that you don't. No wonder we defer to them and sometimes fear numbers. But learning to unpick those numbers, particularly the ones that sound too good to be true and probably are, it won't just help you avoid being stitched up by your phone company. It also helps you to see the assumptions that people are making about the world, the numbers that shape politics and the world around us, because they're really just numerical expressions of very human values, assumptions, hopes, and fears. Here's Rob with the final word.
So don't conflate arithmetic and number sense with calculus and quadratic equations and stuff, because the latter, whilst lovely and important in very niche areas, you're by and large not going to need to use, and as long as you know they exist and can vaguely remember they were quite helpful in some cases, that's all you need to know. I think it's just really good to have enough tools in your armory to have a number sense, to know that a number is in the right order of magnitude, and it actually takes a bit of practice maybe, but to remember that, 750 and 820 in some contexts, they're basically the same. And well, they're not, they're 70 different, but they're basically the same when compared with 10 million. So that whole sense of ballpark, and often to get a good sense of ballpark means brushing up on a bit of arithmetic and just get back on some of those little exercises. Some people like doing a puzzle in the morning, Wordle or whatever. So do a number game thing just to brush up on it and say, well, anyway, what's 13 plus 9? Oh, that's easy. Anyone can do that. Okay, well, keep going until you get, well, that's not easy. And then say, well, I'll just practice those until it is easy, and learning some shortcuts and so on. And one of the other things we've not talked about, but it's ubiquitous, is percentages, which people struggle with. It's the most common, difficult-ish piece of maths that people learn at school they're going to need, because every other story includes a percentage. And just remind yourself what that is. It's got some counterintuitive bits to it, but percent just means divided by 100. It's just a fraction. 33% is 33 divided by 100. So you can have more than 100%. You can have 140%, because it's just 140 divided by 100. Well, that exists. Because what you can't have, not with any sensible stuff, is a 1,500% reduction in drug prices, which I think Donald Trump claimed to have achieved, which means you're being paid now to take these things. That's not how percentages work. But by remembering that percent of just means divided by 100, of means multiplied by, that can take you a long way to getting this fiddly thing. And then do some reading around it. Some very accessible stuff out there to read. So my own book on this thing is called Maths on the Back of an Envelope, which is absolutely on message with this. So those people who like it in this kind of argument in written form, then they might find that helpful.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Your Brain on Climate. A huge thanks to the lovely Rob Eastaway for his time. If you like this, check out the back catalogue. Plenty of episodes to go around. You might like that episode about common sense that I did with Dana Young just over a year ago. Please do share this podcast episode with a friend and drop me a review on your podcast medium of choice. This stuff makes a huge difference to a little old indie podcaster in a sea of big, rich companies with colossal marketing budgets. And if you're particularly moved to help, you might consider chucking in the price of a cup of tea to support the running costs of this esteemed organ over at the usual place, patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. I will be back soon. Until then, sleep tight and don't let the percentages bite. Okay, bye-bye.